engage in much more time-consuming and somewhat more perilous activity of underground printing. However, there's a huge price tag attached, because an underground newspaper is not only information, it's also a commitment. You receive an underground newspaper, you receive with it the information that somebody out there is risking his freedom so that you can be informed. This puts you under an obligation. You don't just dump the newspaper in the wastepaper basket after you're through with it. You at least pass it on, or possibly you want to do something more. So Lenin was absolutely right when he said that the newspaper is a great collective organizer. The internet is nothing like that. Tapping away on your keyboard is an autistic activity. It does not generate any kind of social obligation or social contact. So I'm very worried that the internet might, because it's so much easier, replace underground printing and therefore eliminate this aspect of social dissidence.
But I think that the internet and the bloggers could play a very, very important role in identifying instances of deliberate deception and newspeak and blogging them out.
In a democracy.
In a democracy. Mm-hmm. And I think that would be really a very constructive contribution that internet and bloggers could make.
Masha?
I want to add to what Kostek said. I think that what we're seeing in Russia with blogging and with a lot of information that's available on the internet has a very odd effect. On the one hand, I would disagree. I think there's some community building that is happening through blogging, and so in that sense, it can potentially function as an organizer. On the other hand, what it does is it increases the level of individual comfort to a point where it probably makes dissent almost impossible, because the level of discomfort that is necessary for any kind of activism is simply out of reach. As long as you can consume any kind of information in the privacy of your own home and sort of fill the gaps that are left by what's happening out there in the real world, you are not moved to act.
I had a very limited time. There was three questions which concerned, how to put it, the instrumentality or the conscious nature in which propaganda is used. So this goes primarily to Orwell and Masha and maybe to Jack. One question was, how conscious was Chairman Mao in applying this propaganda of the underlying philosophical or religious, the undertow that was being activated through his statements? Perhaps also in today's Soviet Union, how consciously are these nostalgic aspects, I should say today's Russia, how consciously are these elements being used, or is this something more reflexive?
I'm not sure I actually understand the question. I mean, I think I don't see an important distinction between reflexive use of this kind of nostalgia and conscious use of this kind of nostalgia. If we know that nostalgia sells, is that conscious or reflexive? Does it matter?
Well, I think in China's case, and I think this is true perhaps in any society that has an authoritarian sort of tradition, cultural tradition, political tradition, that these things sort of happen almost spontaneously. It's amazing to me that they've received so little analysis, because I do think what Orwell saw was only the thin surface on the top, and there was a much deeper, more complex whole set of dynamics going on underneath in the most effective socialist societies and authoritarian societies that depended on propaganda.
Jack?
Orwell was one of a group of writers who wrote against communism in his day. Another was Arthur Koestler, author of the novel Darkness at Noon. The key moment in that novel is the novelization of the Russian show trials of the 1930s, and an attempt to go inside the mind of those who seemed sincerely to confess and take their punishment as if a true-hearted communist could do no other. And there I think Kessler was onto something, that there comes a moment when this interior process makes a convert into a true believer. But there's also an awareness in these writers, and especially so, I think, in Orwell, in the way that apologetics always works. If you're going to defeat the opponent, you really do need to understand the opponent. And even if your only goal in defeating him is a narrow, power-hungry desire for total control, still you've got to bear his ideas in mind as you go. So there's a kind of double-mindedness that is just an intermediate step. In the long run, you want total unanimity. You want that single concept that was in the passage that George Soros quoted. But I think there's more self-consciousness and subtlety about it in certain key practitioners than my colleagues just said.
Will you allow one last question? This goes to George Soros. There were so many versions of this question, I have to ask it. I will condense about 5, and these are the following. 1, are strategies of propaganda used in impacting financial markets? It's a little bit off our subject, but I think a lot of people are curious about your answer. And secondly, how will these conclusions that you've reached change the way in which you wish to fight for an open society?
Yeah, I think that we really have to reconsider open society the way I said, that we really have to reconfirm our commitment to the pursuit of truth, better understanding of reality, and also that we can't take open society for granted. So, you know, in all our activities, we basically just took it for granted what open society stands for. I never needed to explain it to anybody in Eastern Europe because they knew exactly what it meant. It meant the opposite of the regime in which they were living, right? Today, it's much more complicated. And certainly in the United States, it is much more complicated because we are an open society, but we don't understand the principles of open society. So it's a strange contradiction. And we really need to rededicate ourselves to the values that have made America great because we have lost our way. We have been misled, and we are on a false track. And we have to somehow regain our sanity.
Well, I think on that very bright note, we should bring this to an end. Thank you very much for being here.
Coming up next time, the discussion continues with 3 masters of modern political communication. Is the age of propaganda over, or are politicians and pundits refining the techniques of manipulation? Check links listings for the broadcast of There You Go Again, Orwell Comes to America, The Science of Manipulation, a fascinating debate about the state of discourse in American politics. This program is brought to you by Link TV for educational and non-commercial use only. Link TV is the only U.S. network dedicated to global and national news, uncompromising documentaries, and diverse cultural programs. Programs that connect you to the world.